today we are going to paint this watercolor flower. If you don't like red, you could paint this purple, you could paint this orange, whatever color you want. And this background, you can choose whatever color you want to paint with that. But the thing I like about this project is we're using what we've learned so far in watercolor to paint this. We're going to be glazing, we're going to be having these light and dark areas, and that's one of the hardest parts with watercolor, is to get it to not mix. But watercolor will not go where there is no water. So if it's dry and you paint by it, then it's not going to bleed or kind of seep out into that other color or mix. So when you're painting these light areas, just make sure the area around it is dry. Here's another trick that I don't tell you in this lesson, but I want to give it to you before you start. You could take little pieces of tape and just tape over these spots. And what will happen is then when you paint over them, it won't really matter that it will stay white, and then you can paint them yellow. You could even paint them yellow, let them dry, and then put tape over them if you want to. You could also paint a different flower if you wanted to, but we're gonna be painting this one. It's a really fun lesson, and I've taught this to kids from the ages 5 to adults that are 70, 80 years old. And it's really fun, and I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is take our tape, and we're going to make a square on our paper, because the picture that we're going to paint is actually square, and so that's what we want to have our paper look like. So I'm just going to move it over just a little bit. So you can grab your tape, and go ahead and make a square. See if you can make it so that this is square. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit from the top and up a little bit from the bottom. And then I'm going to add tape on the sides as well. And after we tape it, we are going to draw this flower. One thing that's important when drawing like this is to look at the negative space. So the negative space is the space around the flower. So anytime you see this background, these are important shapes because they help us figure out where these petals are. For example, we know that there's one right here, so let's just draw a shark fin right there at the bottom of our paper. And what about over here? Let's go ahead and draw that shark fin. And what about this shark fin? This one's kind of flat on the bottom, but then it totally curves up. And then there's just a triangle up here. And on this side, we have this bump, and then it bumps back out over here. So this is the negative space. That's the space around it. And sometimes when there's a lot going on or something like this, sometimes that negative space is really helpful in our drawing. So then we're just going to make a little point in the middle here, and we're going to connect these petals to it. So let's draw this big one right here because it's in front of the rest. So we're going to connect this one. We're going to swoop it down and then bring it in. Swoop this one over and bring it in. And then we have a petal right here, and it actually starts right here. So we're going to curve this petal in and then just attach back onto this line right there. So we now have these two petals and this third petal behind them. And then we can see this petal is on top of these other petals. So this one, we're just going to start right here and bring it back into the middle. This one, we're going to start here and bring it back out to the side. And that looks way too small. So I'm going to fix it. I feel like this shark fin should have been moved over just a little bit. And bring it back into the center. And then this really is just an enormous, enormous petal back there. And then we can see these little hot dog things right in here. So we're going to draw them in. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6. And then these all just attach back into the center. They do curve, but I might not curve them. It's going to be a little bit hard if you've never drawn. If you have, you can go ahead and draw the curves back in. But if you haven't, just attach them with a tube. If you're more advanced, you could probably handle doing that the way that it actually is in the image. And then we're just going to create these little folds, almost like 2 little whiskers coming out from the center on most of these petals. There's definitely a big one in there, in here, 2, and then there's just 1 in the middle of that one. These are folds in the petals. All right, let's get ready to paint. Grab your watercolors, your water, paper towel, and a paintbrush. We're just going to be using a round brush today. So make a big puddle in your tray, and I mean big because we want to cover all of these petals. We're going to paint from light to dark, and the very first thing we're going to do is to create a puddle of pink. And again, if you want to change, not again, but if you want to change this color, you can. This is your painting. Don't feel like you have to do it exactly how I'm doing it. I'm just trying to teach you a way to do it, but you might find a better way to do it, and that's okay. So drop some red in there. We're just gonna see that color. That's a nice light color. I might want it to be just a little bit brighter and darker. So I'm gonna add even more red to it. You could add a little bit of purple if you wanted, or even a little bit of green if you don't want it to be as bright. I'm just gonna keep it really bright. So I'm just gonna keep that, and then I'm just gonna paint in all of these petals. Just make sure you don't scrub your paper. So that means going over it more than once or really working it, like scrubbing into it like that. You don't want to do that. And I do like painting it petal by petal. And what I would do is paint around these yellow things if you can. If that is not possible, then don't worry about it. But if you can, just paint around them. Even leaving just like a little white area. Those, maybe we should have painted the yellow on those first. Let's just keep going. Let's finish painting your petals pink. Using that brush, you know, maybe the flat brush would have covered this area a little bit more. This is a humongous petal. Biggest one I've seen yet. And flowers are all so different. So don't think that if yours looks a little bit different than mine, that is great. This is just a practice, really. I don't want you to all paint the exact same flower as me. That would be really boring. I hope yours look a lot better. Okay, and you can see I have left a few little areas of white in there, and that's okay, but if that bothers you, you can touch it up, cover those up. All right, now let's make my puddle is gone. Yours might still be there, but I need to create another one with more red. And this red, I am going to bring inside of these areas in here and get them just a little bit darker. The lightest parts, there are really light parts on these petals, like in the middle of this one, but the darkest part is definitely in the center. So let's start on this one back here, and let's just add, it's still pretty wet, so I'm gonna just drop in a really darker color. Just over the top. If yours is dry, that's okay. It won't bleed as much as mine is. And that's good. Like you can see, mine is just kind of getting lost. But we are starting to get a little bit of depth. It's a little bit darker in the center. So I'm just going over those lines that we made before. And then with that color that we just mixed up, since it's blending so nicely, you might want to just add some of this. Do you see all of these lines on this flower? I'm just going to start adding some of those. So they kind of come out from the center and go up the petal. It's different than like veins in a leaf would be. They do curve a little bit. Okay. While we are waiting for that to dry, let's mix up an even darker color in here. And I think we need to start adding maybe another color to darken it up. Like maybe a green. We could add a green to it. You could add black to it. You could add brown if you wanted. Right now it's just really, really a bright color. And so let's see, I'm going to add green, but if you want to add black, you could, or you could add brown. What would happen if you added blue? What color would it turn? Purple. That's right. All right, so let's go ahead and grab that color, and we're going to go over those lines. Some of them are dry, some of them are not, so I'm gonna work over here a little bit more where it's not as dry, and I'm gonna come straight out from the center onto the petals. So I'm kind of going just around those shapes that we made in the beginning. And then what I'm going to do, and you could kind of paint the background in right now if you wanted. I'm gonna fan my brush, I'm gonna smash it. And then we're going to do some dry brushing on these petals. And if it won't stay, it just means it's probably a little bit. This brush is not really used to being used in this way. So that dry brush, and then I'm just going to follow those petals and just add some texture on them. And I really am trying to get this texture of these stripes. So if it's not working for you, it might not, your brush might not be dry enough. And now while we're waiting for that to dry, let's go ahead and paint in some of this light yellow, these things in the center. So when you paint these in, just leave a little bit of white around them or it might blend into the color around it. If the color around it is dry, which means it's not shiny, then you can paint the whole thing in and not worry about it. But if the area around it is a little wet, it's probably going to bleed out into it. So we don't want that to happen. All right, now let's get that red again with whatever color you chose to make it darker. And we're just going to paint a few little details and then we'll paint our background and you're finished. You might have already finished before me. You might even be faster than I am. So I'm just going to add some of this detail coming out from the center. And then I'm going to add these little stems that bring these back in. And you could add some shadows on these yellow areas if you wanted. You could add a little bit of black to the yellow or brown to the yellow. That's a lot of brown to the yellow. And maybe add just a little bit of shading or some dots. Because they're kind of textured. They have like this really cool texture. And then you can paint the background and you can paint it whatever color you want. You could paint it solid black, you could paint it green, you could paint it any color you want. So I'm just dipping my brush in my paint. I think I'm gonna paint it green. So it looks maybe like this flower is like in the wild, not in my kitchen in a vase. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of red to my green so it's not so bright. And then I'm going to paint in this background area. And I am going to leave just maybe a little white road in between my background and my flower. So just paint in those little shark fins that we drew in the beginning. Those are our backgrounds, the negative space. And then once this is dry, take your tape off and you are finished. A little tip too, if you get a ton of paint on your tape, you can take your paper towel and just dry it off before you take the tape off, and then you won't get drips of paint on your painting. Just a little tip. So remember to take the tape off in the order that you put it on there. I hope you enjoyed painting that with me and that it turned out well. These are usually the paintings that I see people hanging up in their houses and those portraits. Let's face it, probably all of these. But even if it ends up on the fridge, that's pretty great too. One thing I wanted to say is as you were painting, maybe what parts worked and what parts didn't, what parts were hard and what parts were easy. And then maybe those are the things that you can work on with watercolor and you can improve those skills. So now what I want you to do, since you've done 5 watercolor lessons, which is a lot, you've learned so many things. Now your assignment is to paint whatever you want with watercolors. If you need ideas, I'm full of them. You could paint fruit, you could paint a portrait, you could paint more flowers, you could paint a landscape, you could just turn on some music and just paint some colors on your paper. Maybe paint it with water first, cover it with water first and then drop colors in and do that nice wet and wet technique. Or paint a snowy scene and put some salt in there for texture. This project is totally yours and I hope you have fun with it, but I do really, really want to see it. And thank you so much for painting watercolor with me. I love watercolors. It was one of my hardest things that I did when I was in school. It's because I wasn't using enough water. I was always doing dry brushing and I couldn't figure out why I couldn't fill in the shapes. But when you mix up a lot of color in those puddles, it really, really helps your painting a lot, no matter how old you are. And I hope those little tips helped you and that you really liked painting with watercolor, and have a wonderful day.